Sewing has been both a skill and an art form as long as people have been wearing clothes. Up until midway through the 20th century, either you made your own clothes, got and mended hand-me-downs, or if you were wealthy enough, paid a trained and skilled craftsman to make it for you. Over the past 100 years, and especially in the last 50 years or so, we've seen a decline in the number of people sewing, in large part thanks to the fast fashion industry making it cheaper and easier to buy clothes instead of making them. However, in the last 5 years or so, I've seen a resurgence in the number of people taking up sewing, whether it's for costume purposes or just wanting to get away from the cheaply made and frankly boring mainstream fashion. I was fortunate to grow up surrounded by creative, crafty women. Both my grandmothers were avid sewists, and my mom has always had a passion for historical dress and cosplay. So between the three of them, I knew the basics of sewing long before it became a serious interest. But if you're just starting out, if your New Year's resolution is to finally make your first sewing project, the sewing aisle at the craft store can be kind of intimidating. So today I'm going to walk you through my sewing kit, the essentials that you gotta have, plus a few things that I've found make my sewing life easier, and might do the same for you. So whether you're wanting to start sewing for historical costuming, cosplay, or making outfits for your wardrobe that actually fit your aesthetic, here's what you'll want to get started. In order to sew anything, you need sewing needles. Don't have a needle? Can't really sew. And when you're starting out, there's really only 3 needles that you need. One is a long, straight needle. This is useful for basting pieces of fabric together or going through thick layers of fabric. The next is a smaller, general sewing needle. There are a bunch of different sizes, and generally, the higher the number, the smaller the needle. This is a number 10 sharp. And I bought a pack of these because Bernadette Banner recommended them. It can take a little bit of getting used to because it is so small, but I love the precision and the tiny stitches you can get with these. There are lots of other needle sizes in between these two, and you can get a pack with a variety of options and play around with what feels most comfortable for you and the specific project you're working on. Now, it might be tempting to grab one of those spinny wheels and needles that you see at the dollar store, but honestly, they're cheaply made, and I've heard stories of some of them having little burrs of metal either on the inside or the outside of the eye, which can snag on the fabric or shred your thread. So for a few dollars more, I recommend picking up a pack from a reputable company. For example, Dritz has a pack of 50 needles on Amazon for less than $10. The other needle I recommend having is a tapestry needle or an even larger yarn needle. You're not going to be sewing with these, but they are very useful for threading cording through a channel, drawstrings through a waistband, or if you're into historical costuming, lacing up a corset or kirtle. As you sew more, you can expand your collection, and it's always handy to have a few spares on hand just in case one breaks or bends, which they inevitably will. Thread is how you join your fabric pieces together, and so is absolutely essential. Just like with sewing needles, if you don't have thread, you're not going to get very far in your project. The 2 most common threads you'll see are made of cotton or polyester, but you can also find threads made of silk, linen, or wool. Generally, you want your thread choice to match to the fiber content of your project. So if you're using cotton fabric, you want cotton thread. If you're making a polyester garment, use polyester thread. Polyester is by far the strongest thread, but keep in mind, polyester is made from plastic. So if you're wanting complete historical accuracy, or if you're trying to be more environmentally conscious, you want to stick with natural fibers like cotton, linen, wool, or silk. Silk thread is awesome and feels lovely in the hand and gives a lovely shine to all your stitches. It's also quite strong, although because it's pricier, I don't tend to use it much for the assembly of a garment, unless it's a silk garment, but I will absolutely use it for finishing touches and places where the stitches are going to be visible. Linen thread is a lot of fun to stitch with, especially if you're making a linen garment. The one thing you want to keep in mind though is that on its own it can become untwisted or snap, so you want to make sure that you wax your linen thread. This just means running it along a piece of wax a couple of times. This helps to strengthen the thread and keeps all the little micro threads in place instead of rubbing up against the fabric as you stitch. You can buy jeweler's wax at pretty much any bead or craft store, which comes as a little puck shape in a nice little case. The case also has helpful little ridges to guide you along. Or you can pick up a block of beeswax at a farmer's market. This has quickly become my favorite option as it's really easy to handle and you get the lovely scent of beeswax with every stitch. And in terms of colors, generally, you want to match your thread color to the color of your garment as much as possible. This will help keep the stitches less noticeable, and overall, your project will look more polished. But if you're just starting out, you can absolutely get away with a white thread for lighter color garments and a black thread for darker color garments, and branch out as you gain more experience. Don't let anyone nitpick at you for not matching your colors precisely, especially if you're a beginner. Fun fact, I have this massive spool of pink thread that I bought 5 years ago for my Shindig Kaylee cosplay, and because I have so much of it left, I also used it for most of my patchwork housecoat, which barely had any pink at all. To turn a single piece of fabric into multiple pieces that will eventually become a garment, you will need something to cut into your fabric. While technically you can cut fabric with any pair of sharp scissors, you will get much better results with a dedicated pair of fabric shears. Fabric shears tend to be a bit longer than average scissors, and the handles are designed to be more ergonomic when cutting fabric out while keeping the fabric in place. The blades also tend to be a better quality than average scissors. If you've spent any amount of time on social media with crafty people, you've probably seen at least one meme about fabric shears. And the memes are right. You want to use your fabric shears only for cutting fabric. Using them on any other surface, including pattern paper, will dull the blades much faster and also cause little tiny nicks in the blades which can snag on the fabric. So you'll want to have at least one regular pair of scissors as well for cutting out paper patterns, boning, wired ribbon, etc. These can be just plain ordinary scissors, or if you're going for ultimate aesthetic, you can buy the Shears of Destiny. Okay, brief note about these. They look really cool, and they make for some awesome shots in my videos, but they are not the most comfortable scissors in the world. The decorative detailing really digs into your fingers after a while, so they tend to be a bit more of a novelty item and used for small projects. But if you're going for a fantasy vibe in your environment, these definitely hit the mark. It's also handy to have a pair or two of smaller scissors for cutting threads and fiddly spots. I have these little craft ones which are helpful for any little trimming jobs or cutting finicky parts of patterns, and I also have embroidery snips. These make so much sense, and they're so easy to use. You can keep a hold of your project and snip with one hand. Very helpful. I bought a 2-pack of these at the dollar store, and they're serving me very well. Now, what about when you mess up? Notice I did not say if you mess up, because even experienced sewists will need to take out a seam sometimes. Enter the seam ripper. This is a handy little gadget, and you can use it either by gently picking the stitches, or if you're careful and the fabric isn't too delicate, you can place it along the seam, red bead side down, and cut open the seam. Just be careful when you do that, because it's really easy for it to slip and go too far, and you can actually cut into the fabric itself rather than the threads, and then you are really up the creek. You can find basic seam rippers at the dollar store or on Amazon. My current one is a bit of a level up. This was a Christmas gift that my brother picked up from Lady of the Lathe, one of my favorite Ontario Ren Fair vendors. I will link them below if anyone wants to check them out. Last one is a bit more optional, but if you're doing a lot of patchwork, bias tape, or working with delicate fabrics that tend to shift around a lot, you might want to look at a rotary cutter. These are really nice for crisp, straight lines, especially if you use them beside a ruler. You do need to have a mat underneath your cutting surface, but self-healing mats can be found at pretty much any craft store. I use mine interchangeably with scissors depending on the project. The only time it doesn't work well is for fine corners and those finicky spots. Then just swap back to a pair of scissors. If you're doing hand sewing, and inevitably in every project there will be at least a little bit of hand sewing, you will want a thimble. Now, I will be the first to admit that there are times when I skip using a thimble, usually because the fabric is light enough that I can pinch the needle instead and push it through without discomfort. However, if the fabric is heavy, or if you're planning on doing a large amount of hand sewing, a thimble makes it much more comfortable and allows you to sew for longer periods of time. The main complaint I see against thimbles is that they don't fit. They're loose and wobbly and awkward. But thimbles come in different sizes. You want one that goes on your middle finger and fits snugly. A sign of a good fit is that you can turn your hand upside down and it doesn't fall off. If you have a metal thimble, you can pinch it smaller or just look for a different size. The other option is a leather thimble, and while you can buy them, they're also pretty easy to make with a little bitty scrap of leather. I made this one by marking my finger measurement up to the first knuckle, punching some holes with an awl, and then whip stitching all the way around with some well-waxed linen thread. You can also get ceramic or silicone thimbles. I've never tried them myself, but they are definitely an option. Now for joining your pieces of fabric together, the most common option is pins. There are a few varieties out there, the two most popular choices being either a metal head or a plastic or glass bead. Which one you choose really comes down to personal preference and comfort. I like the pins with a bead head as I find them easier to grab onto. The metal ones are nice, but they can be really fiddly, especially if you have short nails. You will also need a place to carry and store pins. I tend to use a little Tupperware box as it's really easy to move around, and a lid means I can throw it in a travel bag and not worry about them going everywhere. If I'm in the middle of a project and need them handy, I'll stick them in a pin cushion. I made this one a few years ago in one of my earliest videos, and it has a strap for my wrist, so my pins are always close by. You can also find this traditional style at any craft store, and the little strawberry is filled with sand or emery powder to sharpen your pins and needles. The only place you do not want to keep your pins while you're sewing is in your mouth. It can be tempting, especially if you're pinning a finicky project, to just pop it in and hang on to it. And I'm guilty of that myself even now. But I've heard horror stories of what can potentially happen. Not going to go into detail, but just going to leave it at, don't do it. Measuring tapes are going to play a big role in your sewing, from adjusting patterns to marking hemlines to planning trim and more. And there are loads of different types of measuring devices, so these are the ones I use on a regular basis. First up is the most popular, plastic measuring tape. These are handy for pretty much everything, although do check on them after a while because being plastic, they can stretch over time, which means that your measurements, especially at the beginning of the measuring tape, could end up being a little bit off. A free option is going to IKEA and grabbing their paper tape measures. I cannot take credit for this idea. Bernadette Banner suggested this long ago. I always grab a little stack each time I'm there. They can be trimmed down, they're lightweight, they do not stretch, but they are prone to crinkling and tearing. For curved lines like armholes, a French curve is very handy. Then you're not guessing on the curve, you know that it's nice and smooth. And you can play around with the angle to get exactly the right curve that you want. For long straight lines, there are a couple of options. One is the classic yardstick. I use this especially for cutting out hemlines or long sets of straight grain ruffles. And you can also get quilting rulers. These come in a wide variety of lengths and widths. These are really good in combination with a rotary cutter. The lines you get are super crisp. But unless you're planning to start with quilting or other precise patchwork projects, I'd say you can hold off on these for a little while. They are definitely handy now that I have them, but I didn't get my first one until 2024, 3 years into my serious sewing journey. These next items are important to have on hand, but don't fit into any one definitive category, so miscellaneous it is. An iron. One of the most underrated and overlooked aspects of sewing, especially when you're starting out, is ironing your seams. Believe me, as someone who kind of skipped that part at first, it makes a world of difference. Ironing can be the difference between your garment looking well-tailored and professional and looking homemade and all. You could get away with skipping this tool at first, but if you're doing any kind of historical sewing involving hand-sewn eyelets, or if you're doing drawstrings or making your own bias tape, or anything like that, an awl is going to be very useful. It pushes the fibers of the fabric apart instead of breaking them, which is important, especially when you're making a structural garment. You need those holes to take a lot of pressure or tension. And if you are interested in making your own bias tape instead of buying packs at the store, there are kits available that speed up the process tremendously, and they come with an awl to help feed the fabric through the bias feeds. Marking tools. Even if you're cutting a pattern fresh out of the package with no alterations, it's good to mark around the outline. And if there are markings like gathering points or balance markers, you'll want to be able to make a quick mark so you don't lose the spot after you remove the pattern. When you're doing your initial mock-up of a project, you can get away with pens of any kind. For instance, I've marked out mock-ups with Sharpies and glitter gel pens. Pencils work pretty well. Some pens do a decent job, including heat-sensitive pens where the lines will actually disappear when you iron over them. The other common marking method is chalk. You can get Taylor's chalk, which comes in multiple colors, or chalk pens. Now, these are great, but do have their occasional downsides. On some fabrics like heavy wool, chalk just isn't going to show, or it's going to wipe away super easily. Also, with the pens, I found that the chalk leads tend to snap fairly easily, so if you get one of these, make sure you're mostly using it on smooth fabrics. Needle minders. Okay, these are more of a it's nice but not absolutely necessary thing, but I still wanted to share them because they show up in a lot of my videos. Mostly you see these advertised for cross-stitch, but I have found them to be really helpful with regular sewing as well. They're basically just a flat surface with 2 magnets on the back. For cross-stitching, you put 1 magnet under your Aida cloth and then the top piece on the front of the Aida cloth, and then you don't lose your needle. For regular sewing, I actually keep one on a pair of embroidery snips. That way I always have a needle of choice handy. And I also keep one on the front of my sewing machine, and that gives me a handy place to put my pins as I remove them. Now, you can absolutely get away with not using one of these, but they are really nice to have on hand. Storage. This is less crucial if you only sew in one place, but if you happen to do a lot of hand sewing on the go, a travel option is very handy. You can use a small bag, a clutch, or in my case, I use a cute little travel bin. This is just big enough to fit my sewing supplies and any accessories I might need, and at home, I use it for keeping all the knickknacks of my current project on hand. And I gave it cute stickers too. This is big enough that I can fit my pin box, threads, ribbons, whatever, and take it with me on a road trip. When I was working on my white Christmas dress, we were in the middle of house showings before we moved. So I had to be able to grab my stuff and be out of the house at a moment's notice. So I would keep my threads, sequins, appliques, etc. in there, and I would take my Judy dress to the local library to sew. I've also used a makeup bag in the past, which also has a fair bit of space for basic supplies. So you've got your supplies. What are you going to make for your first project? With thousands of patterns out there, it can be a little intimidating to choose. Whether you're going for historical, cosplay, or everyday wardrobe, start with something basic at first. I'm going to do a whole video a little later this year on my favorite patterns, but here are a couple of simple recommendations. For a first historical project, you could start with a shift or chemise. These can be used for multiple centuries and are basically just squares and rectangles. There are also some great videos here on YouTube about making pirate shirts, which again are basically just squares and rectangles, and you look awesome when it's finished. For fantasy or cosplay, a cloak or cape can be really easy, either using a pattern or just gathering a big rectangle into a neckband. For modern clothing, I would suggest checking out a company like Simplicity or McCall's. They have a lot of beginner patterns, and you can generally find some pretty reasonable prices. The one place I would urge caution is Etsy. They have become absolutely inundated by AI-generated patterns. Those patterns have not been tested by the sellers, and the other creators who have tried them have said they are garbage. The pattern pieces don't actually join together properly, the instructions don't make sense, and if you try to use one for your first project, you will end up frustrated and discouraged. So if you see patterns on Etsy that look priced too good to be true, have a close look at the images and the reviews, and if it looks AI, it probably is AI, so stay away. And let me wrap up with fabric choices. A fabric can make the difference between a project going well and going not so well. Good fabrics to start out with are linen and cotton. These are easy to cut and sew with and can be bought for not too much money. Some polyesters also work to start out, although remember, polyester is plastic, so it's not that great. Wool and wool blends and silk or silk style are also great, but tend to be on the pricier side. Basically anything with a straight weave, meaning that it looks woven and not knit, and if you pull straight up and down and side to side, there isn't any stretch. And if your budget is tight, the thrift store is your friend. My go-to fabrics for mock-ups and practice projects are thrifted bed sheets. And they can make great project fabrics too. The lining of my patchwork housecoat started as a flannel bed sheet, and my recent Fiero dress was a cotton bed sheet. Now, fabric can range between thrifted bed sheets that you get for $5 and ultra luxury material that costs hundreds of dollars per yard. I would recommend holding off on expensive fabric until you've got a few projects under your belt and you know your confidence is on the rise. I recently made a waistcoat out of the most glorious wool, for those in the know, from the legendary Beckensteins in New York. And because I had splurged and spent quite a lot on a single yard, it sat in my stash for 2 whole years before I made this waistcoat, because I was scared to cut into it. Once you're comfortable with the idea, absolutely, go forth, buy your dream fabric, and make your dream outfits and look fabulous. But if this is your very first project, for ease of mind, you don't need the expensive stuff. In terms of specific types of fabric to avoid for your first project, first off, avoid anything knit or stretch. Both of these styles require a bit more know-how to use properly, and some stretchy fabrics like spandex even require a specialized machine to make a really secure seam. Don't give yourself a headache if you're just starting out. Also, don't necessarily start with slinky fabric like organza or acetate. These are both really lightweight and slip and slide around a lot, which from experience can be a major headache. Now, those are just suggestions. Feel free to dive in the deep end. My first big projects were a frock coat and a floofy dress, which has layers upon layers upon layers of pleated organza. But sometimes we just gotta channel Doctor Who and say Geronimo. So I hope you found my suggestions helpful. If you did, please hit the like button. If you're starting out sewing, let me know in the comments what your first project will be. And if you're a seasoned sewist, tell us what your first project was. Maybe shed a little sage advice of your own for the newbies. We're all here to help each other out. If you feel like sticking around, please consider subscribing, and I will see you soon for more geekery meets history sewing adventures. There are also some great videos here on YouTube, making it cheaper. However, for long straight lines, really, Ruby? For long straight lines, they're, really, Ruby? I use this especially for cutting